In Book 1 of the Republic, we saw Socrates take on a bully, Thrasymachus, and argue about the definition of justice. Thrasymachus starts out by saying that justice is whatever is in the interest of the stronger, but we saw that he keeps shifting his ground as Socrates criticizes his views. At the end of Book 1, Thrasymachus gives up and decides, forget it, there's no point in talking to Socrates. Lots of people end up in Platonic dialogues deciding the same thing. But we noticed that the question on the table really shifted. It started with the question, what is justice? And by the end it had become a debate about whether it's better for a person to be just or unjust, whether justice is really in the interest of the just person. Thrasymachus seems to argue that it isn't, that basically justice dooms the just, that it takes someone who is trying to be just and ends up putting them in a position where they just consistently lose. Nice guys finish last, Leo de Rocher said. Well, that seems to be Thrasymachus' position too. And so Socrates emerges from Book 1 victorious, but also leaving us a little unsettled. He himself says we shouldn't really accept this conclusion until we really know what justice is. In other words, this question of whether justice is in the interests of the just person really depends, in a sense, on what justice is. And we better settle that before we really come down to any kind of conclusion about whether justice is in someone's interest. Now, at the beginning of Book 2, Glaucon says, what are you trying to do, Socrates? Are you trying to persuade us, or are you just trying to seem to persuade us? Socrates is taken aback. This is the kind of question Socrates often asks. But Glaucon says, look, I'm not persuaded by this. You've given various reasons to Thrasymachus, but it all seems kind of inconclusive. Really, I think the person who is unjust is better off. And after some discussion initially, that I'll talk about in a second, he ends up challenging Socrates with one of the most famous images from the Republic, from all of Plato, and made much more famous by Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. And that is the Ring of Gyges. Let's look at the preliminaries to see how they get there. And then let's examine this argument concerning the Ring of Gyges that Glaucon uses to try to argue that the just person is in fact going to be at a terrible disadvantage. Glaucon's first move is to distinguish instrumental from intrinsic goods. It's a distinction made much more famous by Aristotle and others later, but it appears here already as something that Glaucon uses to challenge Socrates. He says, look, some things we seek for their own sake. They're really intrinsically good. Other things we seek for the sake of something else. They're really means to something. They're tools. They're instruments, hence instrumental goods. Now, some things are both. They're both intrinsically good and they're useful. They're also instrumentally good. In fact, many things really turn out to be like that. Perhaps virtue itself is like that. Pleasure, honor, even self-respect might really be something in that intermediate category, an overlap between instrumental and intrinsic goods. But what are we to say about justice? After all, this question of whether justice is something that is useful for the person who is just, or puts them at a disadvantage, as Thrasymachus thought, Glaucon says, look, that's really a question about whether justice is an instrumental good. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that doesn't seem like that interesting a question. If it turns out that justice really is simply a tool to promote your self-interest, well, gosh, that's not so exciting. If justice is really something that's fundamental to how we ought to live, then it better be an intrinsic good. And so he challenges Socrates to give us an argument that justice is really intrinsically good. Glaucon then proceeds to outline a view of justice that he finds initially plausible and he thinks of as an alternative to Socrates' view. It's basically what we would now call a version of social contract theory, or a contractualist, a contractarian theory. Its outlines here aren't very specific, so it's hard to pin it down precisely. But the general idea, he says, is this. Maybe we do adopt justice and rules of justice, principles of justice, and a conception of justice as a virtue, really just as instruments. We realize conflict is bad, people get hurt, and we don't want other people to treat us unjustly. So we agree to adopt and abide by rules of justice, or at least general principles or general conceptions, in order to try to smooth human relationships. Well, if that's what justice is, it really is just something like a convention that we adopt for the sake of achieving our other aims, and so it's at best an instrumental good. Now, Glaucon finds this a pretty plausible view. Why shouldn't I treat you unjustly? Well, because I don't want you to treat me unjustly. A society where we all agree to abide by rules of justice maybe is better for us than a society where people routinely treat other people unjustly. And so Glaucon says, look, maybe it turns out that justice is a good thing for people, but in fact, it's only in this instrumental way. It's kind of like, yeah, various medications can be good for people, or certain tools, hammers, nails, etc. can be good for people and so on. But really, when you come right down to it, that doesn't give it much ethical significance. We don't talk about the ethics of nails or the ethics of various other kinds of tools. And so, if that's what it is, it's just a tool, well, I mean, it's still a useful tool, and we might want to investigate it and think about what conventions we ought to adopt, but nevertheless, it seems much weaker than what Socrates was really claiming. So here is the example he introduces to try to convince Socrates that at best it's really just an instrumental good. He says, suppose we had something, a ring, the ring of Gyges, which could turn you invisible. It would let you get away with anything. You could commit all sorts of terrible and unjust acts and escape because you would simply become invisible. And he tells a story of Gyges who finds this ring and uses it to commit all sorts of atrocities. He manages to sneak into the palace unobserved. He ends up seducing the king's wife, the queen. He ends up plotting to kill the king. And he gets away with it because any time that he could be discovered, he just turns the ring and he disappears. Well, here is Glaucon's challenge then. Suppose you had the ring of Gyges. What would you do with it? Would you simply use it to further the cause of justice? Or would you use it to your own advantage and act unjustly? Use it to get away with things that otherwise you couldn't get away with? I know, Belle, it's a hard question. My cat agrees. She's baffled. She's lying there thinking, I don't know what I would do. Well, I'm not sure what I would do either. But Glaucon is convinced that people would routinely commit injustices. Maybe not as bad as Gyges, but nevertheless, what would stop you from robbing the bank? Or doing all sorts of other things, sneaking anywhere you wanted. Nothing would be off limits to you. And so, what would really govern our actions in such a case? Now he says, Socrates, let me put the challenge to you in the strongest possible form. He says, the question really comes down to this. Is it better to be just or to simply appear to be just? And so he says, let's contrast two people, one of whom is a just person, always acts justly, but is thought to be unjust, and another person who acts unjustly, but is thought by everyone to be just. Which one has a better life? Which one is it better to be? Would you rather be a just person, thought of as being unjust, or would you rather be an unjust person who people think is just? Glaucon says, I think it would be much better to be the unjust person who is perceived as just. After all, you're going to get all sorts of honors. People are going to think very well of you. You'll get the esteem of everyone else. They will hire you because they think you're acting justly. The person who acts unjustly, but is perceived by everyone to be just, is someone who essentially gets away with everything. And so they can do whatever they want. They can take whatever they want. They can sneak around and go wherever they want. And no one will recognize that they're doing this. Everyone will think they're the perfect moral ideal. They're going to benefit in all sorts of ways from both the unjust action and the perception of justice. On the other hand, think about somebody who acts justly, but is perceived by everyone to be unjust. That person is going to be, well, thought to have committed all sorts of crimes. That person is going to be hated. They're going to be legally charged and punished. And so one person is going to essentially have all the advantages of unjust action and none of the disadvantages. The other person is going to have all the disadvantages of just action, not taking advantage of situations when they could, but all the disadvantages of people thinking that they're unjust. And so which is it better to be? Glaucon says surely it's better to be perceived as just than to actually be just. Now, I'd like to give you at this point Socrates' response, but he doesn't have a quick response to Glaucon. Instead, he says this is a hard challenge, and to respond, I have to go back and really talk in greater detail about the nature of the soul, what it's really like to be a just person or to be an unjust person. But I don't want to do that directly, he says. Let's take a detour and think about justice in the state. Now, I'm going to talk about that argument and that move in a separate video. But before I get to that, let's just observe one thing about this. The idea that there is an analogy between justice in the soul, in the psychology, essentially, of the just person, and justice in society at large, in the state, that's a very bold claim. Why should we think that there's any such analogy? There is an idea here that a state is something like an organism. It's something like a person. And so we can think of a state as analogous to a person. We can think of a society as analogous to a single organism. Now, I think myself that that's a fundamentally mistaken idea. After all, I am an organism. A society isn't an organism. A state is not an organism. And it really is better thought of as something like an ecosystem of organisms. But Socrates pursues that analogy. And so we really need to see how he does it and where he goes with it. But recognize that it's a contentious move, one that echoes throughout the history of philosophy. Many other people make it. But many people also back away from it and say, wait a minute, it's at this point that something goes fundamentally wrong in the Republic.